Welcome back to the Dr. Doug Show, your resource for bone health, hormone optimization, and health span for women, midlife, and beyond. So today I have a really fun interview to present to you. I met with Morley Robbins. Morley Robbins wrote the book, Cure Your Fatigue. This is a book that I read several months ago now, and it's all about iron metabolism, copper. There's a lot in there about vitamin D, but today specifically we're going to talk about iron and copper. So iron and copper are very relevant to the audience of this show because as women go through menopause, there is the potential to start to accumulate iron. The metabolic dysfunction that goes along with that is often misunderstood. It's often missed. How to interpret the labs is pretty rare to be done correctly, in my opinion. And so we've started incorporating a lot of these principles into our practice, and we're seeing some really interesting shifts in biomarkers and how people are feeling. So I want to present this to this audience so you guys can understand this, potentially read this book. We talk a lot about the labs. So again, as usual, I'm trying to help educate people and empower them to do some of this work on their own because it's going to be difficult to find a provider that can help you to understand these things like Morley talks about them. So stick around for Morley Robbins, and I hope you enjoy. All right. Well, Morley, thank you so much for joining me today. We have so many fun things to talk about. And as I said in the introduction, we have 3 of these planned. So I want to be pretty clear about what we're going to go through today. I want to talk mostly about iron and copper today. But before we dig into that, can you give us just a little bit about your background, just how you got into this space, because it is a very, very unique space.
Yeah, and if someone had told me in my 40s that I would be doing this in my 70s, I'd say, I don't think so. So I was born into a very sickly family, a lot of illness. My older sister, became a nurse. I was supposed to become the doctor till I got to college and found out, wow, this is not easy. So I did not get into medical school. I was only rejected by 18 medical schools. And that was a blessing because I didn't get indoctrinated. But I did what any red-blooded American would do. I went to business school to become a hospital executive so I could boss the doctors around. And I did that for 32 years. I was an executive for 12 and a consultant for 20. And traveled all over the country, making hospitals bigger and better, but pulled a suitcase behind my back for 20 years through airports. Developed frozen shoulder, which got me to my now wife, who's a chiropractor, who introduced me to innate healing. And she freed up my frozen shoulder by going into the pterygoid muscle inside my mouth with the full weight of her body. And as she pressed, my arm lifted, and that was a miracle. And then she used that phrase, innate healer, which I had never heard in 32 years of working in hospitals. And that was my wake-up call. I went, if there's an innate healer, why do we have millions of doctors around the world? And that's what led to 15 years of research and the book, Cure Your Fatigue, because in my humble opinion, copper, bioavailable copper, as we'll talk about, is the innate healer that is the best kept secret on planet Earth.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for that history. I hadn't heard you talk about your shoulder like that before. So as an orthopedic surgeon who used to treat frozen shoulder, I can tell you as you experienced that I don't have a lot to offer for that problem. All kinds of things that we can try, but none of them work.
Well, they wanted to operate, and I said, no, that's not the solution.
Yeah.
So,
and I've done that. I've done a shoulder scope on somebody with a frozen shoulder, and it's a disaster in there, and they don't really get better. So it's a really tough problem. So I did not learn that therapy, sticking my finger in someone's mouth.
Oh, it's amazing. Very painful. Very painful.
I would imagine. Yeah. But so is frozen shoulders. So you're in good company with yourself. All right. So let's just talk about, before we get into copper, I want to hit the iron side of this. And this is an area I see a lot, and early on in practice, because I am working with people specifically with osteoporosis. We have a lot of women, perimenopause, menopause. It's the majority of our practice. this is a time in a woman's life where they are very frequently diagnosed with iron deficiency anemia.
Right.
So when I started treating my patients, I was looking at specific biomarkers, which we'll talk about. And I would say, oh, you're iron deficient. I think you would feel better with more iron.
Right.
Now, when I read your book, it blew my mind, like probably true for most physicians that would read it. Basically, what you were telling me is that iron deficiency is probably not iron deficiency, and we need to look at this a totally different way. So let me start by framing this with why do we look at iron the way that you do? And to say that another way, why is iron a problem more often than it is a deficiency? Why do we have likely too much iron to begin with?
Right. Yeah, great question. Again, I think it's important for the listener to understand that there's a difference between low iron in a blood test versus high iron in the tissue. And the blood test does not measure the tissue level. It's very, very important. We've been trained to think that blood is a perfect representation of the body. It's not. It's a perfect representation of the blood.
Right.
And that's the critical distinction, blood versus tissue. And there's important research that you may or may not be familiar with. He's a world-renowned physiologist named Bruce Ames. At the peak of his career, he was the most quoted scientist on planet Earth. He was at Berkeley for over 30 years. And he and one of his colleagues, Dr. Kalilia, did a study in 2004 looking at iron in the blood versus iron in the tissue. And what they found was that there was 10 times more iron in the tissue than showed up in the blood. That's a big deal. 10 times more. That research should have reverberated through medical schools all over the planet, but it didn't. It's stored with the Ark of the Covenant in the Indiana Jones warehouse. And so nobody knows about that research. And so the meme that runs medicine on the planet is you're anemic and you're copper toxic.
Right.
Those two metals have been set in opposition to each other. And it's, you tell a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. And people are convinced that they're anemic because of the blood test. The only way you can find out the tissue level is either a needle biopsy of the liver, it's very painful, you first, or a Tesla 2 MRI, it's very expensive, again, you first. But they're very accurate at telling you what the tissue level of iron is. And it gets us out of this kindergarten-esque perspective of the blood. And the truth of the matter is that we're swimming in iron, which gets back to your very question. We're swimming in iron because we lack sufficient exposure to copper in our diet. And what I've pieced together, and I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I've been studying the research now for 15 years, going back to the late 1800s. Copper was first identified in 1875. It's like, okay, that's intriguing. But they didn't really understand it until the early 1910s, 19-teens. And then there was a real rush by physicians and scientists to understand the dynamic between copper and iron as it relates to making energy, getting inside the mitochondria, and understanding how ATP is really made. There were no other minerals that they were thinking about. And I know we're going to circle back to zinc, but zinc wasn't even on the radar screen. It was copper.
We'll circle back there. Some of the things that really stood out to me in reading your book and now as I'm looking at my patients is understanding that we are exposed to a tremendous amount of iron. And I want you to explain this because I'll get the statistics wrong. But help me and the listeners to understand how much iron we're exposed to both in our environment, in our food, but through supplemented forms and through products, which we prefer it not to be, but then also through, heme iron through meat and then non-heme iron through vegetables. Give us a sense of how much iron we're exposed to, and then the flip side of that is how much of that iron we are actually generally absorbing.
Right. Great question. So in order to answer that question, let me explain something called the iron recycling program that we have in our body.
Yeah.
I'm sure that when you were in school, they talked about the reticuloendothelial system, the RES.
Mm-hmm.
It took me 2 years to figure out that meant recycling. It's really important. And so every second of every day, we need to replace 2.5 million red blood cells every second. So it means we got to take 2.5 million offline. We got to make 2.5 million new ones. So the ones that are being taken offline, those are coming out of our spleen for the most part. The ones that are coming online are coming out of the bone marrow. The bone marrow is found in our femurs, our hips, our other long bones that have that capacity to make new red blood cells, 2.5 million a second. So we've been talking now for about 10 minutes.
That's
right?
That's a lot of red blood cells.
It's a lot of red blood cells. In the course of 24 hours, it's 200 billion red blood cells. Now, what will surprise you is to find out how much iron it takes to support the replacement of 200 billion red blood cells. Now, mind you, the red blood cells, the hemoglobin inside those red blood cells, and there's bazillions of hemoglobin inside one red blood cell, but the amount of iron in 200 billion red blood cells is 25 milligrams. The average adult has over 5,000 milligrams of iron. 25 is just a little tiny bit of iron. Now here's what will shock you. 24 of those 25 milligrams comes from this recycling system, the reticuloendothelial system, that's really regulated by the spleen. It's a critically important organ. It's known as the hidden organ. Nobody knows about it, or the forgotten organ.
Right.
But the point is, 24 of the 25 milligrams are coming from the recycling system that's run by copper. Nobody knows about that. And we need 1 milligram of iron in our diet every day to make up for that additional milligram.
Yeah.
Well, the average person, certainly the average American, let's just stay within the continental U.S. And we're getting probably between 25 to 75 milligrams of iron a day. It's an enormous multiple of the one that we need.
Right.
When you think about the iron fortification, iron supplementation, iron infusions that people are getting, there's a wholesale flooding of iron because of the perception of iron deficiency anemia, as opposed to the anemia of chronic inflammation. That's a completely different beast.
Mm-hmm.
That latter form of anemia is a result of lack of bioavailable copper, not lack of iron. And so when copper is down, what happens is the body starts to accumulate iron, starts to store iron. Where does it store it first and foremost is in our liver. And as the iron starts to get stuck in our liver, it doesn't show up in the blood test, does it? And that's
not as iron, no.
Not as iron. That's right. Very good point. And then what happens is blood test comes back, iron looks low. Nobody's thinking about the liver. Nobody's thinking about the heart. Nobody's thinking about the pancreas, the kidney, the brain, wherever, where the iron is building quietly in the ferritin protein. And what people need to realize is that every facet of iron metabolism runs and is regulated at the discretion of bioavailable copper. And so the reason why this blood is so important is that 70% of the iron in our body is tied up in the hemoglobin of the blood. 70%. If we incorporate myoglobin, we're up to 80% of the iron. So there's enormous bolus of iron in this recycling system that we're so dependent upon. But no one's thinking about that when they see a low blood test, low iron in blood, and they think instinctively, oh, I need more iron. And the food system is designed to make sure that you get that additional incremental iron. And what they've done also beyond just iron fortification, Doug, is they've modified seeds. So when I was born in 1952. So as a little boy, I watched Popeye, right? Every little kid watched Popeye.
Right.
And what did he love to eat? Spinach, right? He'd squeeze the can and spinach would go up in the air and he'd swallow it. Well, spinach back then had a uptake of copper. It's been hybridized now that it takes up iron. It doesn't take up copper. So that's not the only vegetable or food item that's been modified to have a preferential uptake of iron. So we are now swimming in iron in our diet. We're not really aware of it. And the body depends on that iron, can't live without it. But the way the Chinese think about it is they call copper the general and iron is the foot soldier, the grunt.
Right.
What do generals have? They have more stars on their shoulder, right? Stars are made of brass. What's brass made of? Copper.
Copper.
And so the general runs the show quietly in the background, and everyone is taught to focus on iron at their discretion.
Yeah. So before we get into copper, two, I think, really important points for people that are trying to figure this out, if this sounds mind-blowing to them, which is, so two things. One is the only way to get rid of iron is to bleed it out, right? So whether this is, a cycling woman through her monthly cycle or through phlebotomy for those of us that don't have that. And then the other component of that is what happens in the tissues with iron that is building up? Well, what's the downside here?
How much time do we have?
Give me the short version.
Okay. There's a storage protein that everyone's heard of, ferritin, iron storage protein. And that, as iron begins to build, technically that it's a nano cage, little tiny circle that holds 4,500 atoms of iron, up to 4,500. And believe it or not, that ferritin is like an ATM machine. Put iron in, take iron out. Put iron in, take iron out. And that function of in and out runs at the discretion of bioavailable copper. There's an enzyme called ferroxidase, iron oxidase. Let's use oxygen to engage it. And it's able to turn iron into a form that can be inserted in and taken out. Critical function. If that protein, ferritin, becomes denatured, what does that mean? Destroyed. But what it really means is copper loses its bioavailability. Then it becomes something called hemosiderin. You may recall hemosiderin from your training.
Yeah. Well,
hemosiderin holds 10 times more iron than ferritin, but it's never measured in a blood test. Did you know that? No one ever measures hemosiderin.
No, we look for hemosiderin staining, on
hemosiderin staining, right?
Yeah.
But you didn't know that there was 10 times more iron in each molecule of hemosiderin.
Right.
Only two authors that I know of that talk about hemosiderin, Sjogren from 1953 and Sato from 2014. That's a 60-year gap between those two authors. Only two that I've ever found that talked about hemosiderin. That should make your toes curl. And the thing is, if the iron is continuing to build in the body because it's not being properly regulated, that iron becomes magnetic. And what I've been immersing myself in the last week, just in the last week, I've been at this for 15 years, but in the last week, the universe decided, Morley, you're ready to learn about the dark side of iron. And it's called magnetoferritin. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
No, I'd be shocked if you had. I'd be really impressed if you had, but I would be shocked as well. But the thing is, magnetoferritin has magnetic qualities, very powerful magnetic qualities, that is now considered to be the force behind cardiovascular disease, cancer, and neurodegeneration. Not my theory. There's some really bright minds that are working on this. Now, when did they first know this was a problem? 1958. When did it first get prominent scientific recognition? 1992. Kirschvink et al., 1992, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's when it first came on the scene as, Houston, we have a problem. And now, 30 years later, they're still fumbling, trying to figure out why is it happening and how do we stop it? And pardon me, but there's only one way to stop it. And that's to get more bioavailable copper inside the human being that requires the general to run the grunts. And it's a very simple concept that within the military, people get it. Within medicine, not so much.
Yeah. And so, and my understanding too is that iron in general is very oxidative. It responds, it interacts with oxygen very readily. And right. When present in tissues, results in a lot of oxidative stress. Is that
right?
Is that a very simplified way of saying some of this
very
too?
Simplified. It's
okay.
The iron and oxygen have a magnetic attraction for each other, and they love to create rust. We recognize a rusty nail, rusty pipe on the outside. The rusting that's taking place inside is plaque, is protein aggregation in the brain. It's all sorts of missignaling in the body. It's all signs of rust. And here's the way I describe it. Iron causes aging. Every facet of aging is iron-driven, and copper causes longevity.
That's a profound statement. One of the things that we try to do in this channel is to empower people to look at a lot of these things on their own, because it is challenging to find providers who will go down some of these rabbit holes, right? And so one of the things we do is to create content for people. We describe the labs. We help show them, these are ideal ranges, et cetera. So one of the challenges I've had as I've been, continuing to develop our program for our patients is trying to figure out which labs make the most sense. Now, not all of these will likely be available for people that are doing this on their own through some of the cash pay avenues that are out there. But can you walk me through which labs you think are the most relevant with serum iron, TIBC, ferritin, and leave out the copper ones for now? We'll hit those later.
Yeah. No, what I developed was, it's called the Full Monty Iron Panel. And it's a mixture of a dozen different markers. Several of them are iron related. We look at copper. We look at zinc. We look at vitamin A, vitamin D. We look at uric acid, because each of these brings a different perspective of what's happening to the iron inside the body. And to your point, keep this in mind. Iron is the master pro-oxidant element on planet Earth. Oxygen is the second most reactive element on the planet after fluorine gas. So those are two very powerful elements to be managing. And the importance of copper is it's the only element on planet Earth that can regulate iron and oxygen at the same time without any static, without any oxidative stress. And so the point that you're raising about the oxidative stress that's created, what that means is we're as a species, we are light and sound beings. We have frequency, which we're always trying to make energy. And the way we make energy in our body is we activate oxygen. Again, hemoglobin's carrying the oxygen to the mitochondria. We activate that oxygen to become 2 molecules of water. So mitochondria are basically water wheels. They're always making water. And when that water is made at the pH of 7, so you can only make water at the pH of 7, but when the water is being made, it releases 3 energy precursors called ADP, to go over to another complex in the mitochondria to become 3-ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and we make our body weight in ATP every day. The key is activating oxygen to become water. If we can't activate the oxygen, it becomes an oxidant, an accident with oxygen. And that accident with oxygen is going to react, and it's going to become oxidative stress, which is going to produce all sorts of reactions inside the cell. And in the same way that when we drive our car, there's exhaust being given off, but we don't see it. Most of the time, we don't see it. If suddenly there was this billowing black smoke, we would know, oh my gosh, I've got an engine problem. We've got to take it to the mechanic. Well, the billowing black smoke that's coming out of the mitochondria is called uric acid. And that's why we measure it. So we want to know, is that becoming a metabolite that's of significance in the production of ATP? But the focus, the real primary focus is to see if copper and iron are in proper regulation. And what we're looking at is serum iron. That's part of the recycling system. We're looking at transferrin, very important transport protein that shuttles the iron from the spleen to the bone marrow for that 2.5 million cells a second. So transferrin. Then TIBC is another very important marker. It stands for total iron binding capacity. It's a number of docking stations for iron in the blood. And what that reveals is when you divide serum iron by TIBC, you get what's called percent saturation. It creates the illusion of that tissue saturation, but it's not really accurate in that sense. So the blood test there's no aspect of the blood test that gets to the true tissue level, and that's its greatest shortcoming as a diagnostic tool.
Yeah. And so then from a therapeutic perspective, you lay out some thresholds in your book about the percentage saturation, that serum over TIBC.
Right.
Will you talk to me about how ferritin plays in this? So the serum biomarker ferritin, you mentioned it as a storage protein. In your book, you talk about it not really, we shouldn't really even see it in blood, and yet we use it as a very compelling marker for some different things. So how does ferritin work into that?
Yeah. Again, you want simple, right?
Simple.
So there's 4 different types of ferritin. So we have what's called heavy chain ferritin, light chain, secreted, and magnetoferritin. And it was in a conversation with Douglas Kell, who's a world-renowned iron biologist at the University of Manchester several years ago. I asked him, what's the ideal serum ferritin for a human being? And he's one of those Skype calling, he leans forward and says, 0. And I'm like, I'm in free fall. And he said, Morley, I want to make sure you understand this. Rising ferritin in a blood test is not a sign of iron vitality. It's a sign of organ pathophysiology. Do you understand what I just said? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And we've been trained to believe that ferritin is a marker in the blood of stored iron. We've got enough. So here's the ugly truth, though. This is looking at the research of Harrison and Orozio from 1996. A famous classic study it's called The Ferritins, where they introduce us to the reality of what the ferritin is really studying. So we have this nano cage of ferritin. It's got 24 polymers, 24 parts to it, okay? And all 24 of those parts can express the ferroxidase enzyme, or none of them can express the ferroxidase enzyme. And it turns out that different organs have different ratios of heavy to light. The heart has a lot of heavy chain. The liver, so H for heavy, for heart, the liver has a lot of light chain. which means it doesn't have it can store it, but it's not very, very good at that ATM function to let it go. And so the part that you're asking about is the secreted form. Where does that come from? And it's the bookends of serum ferritin that will kill you. Okay? When serum ferritin begins to rise, it's an indication of inflammation, most likely in the liver. And what's happening is the iron needs to be recycled. The body needs to go through what's called autophagy and break down that ferritin cage to release the iron so it can be used to make more red blood cells. That process of autophagy needs to happen under ideal conditions. The part that most people don't know about is that one facet of those ideal conditions is the bioavailability of copper. In order to make the lysosome of the liver cell, so the lysosome is the stomach of the cell, it's where the peptides get digested, you got to have a lot of acid. Well, to make that acid, you got to have copper to run that mechanism to create the hydrogen to increase the acidity. That's a really important piece of the puzzle. And if you don't have that capacity, you can't recycle the iron. And what happens is the iron gets dumped into the liver tissue. 10 amino acids gets cleaved off of the ferritin protein, and then it gets secreted into the bloodstream. And what doctors are not taught is that ferritin in the blood, serum ferritin, is empty shotgun shells. There's no iron in that ferritin. And it's a really important distinction. And then, so that the blood test is a completely inaccurate measure of iron status. And what I've chosen to do is rename it. I call it errortin. It's not ferritin. And then we have the fourth kind is magnetoferritin, which I was alluding to earlier. And that's a whole nother beast that only now they're beginning to understand its presence throughout our body. And it has magnetic qualities, as I mentioned, that completely disrupts the electron flow in the mitochondria and has tremendous downstream impacts on our physiology.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful. Because, we look at this and we have on our panel, we have a whole inflammatory panel and, ferritin and CRP. And, when I see it elevated, of course, oftentimes it's elevated with CRP, but not always. And so
Right.
we're using it, we're looking at it from both sides to say, yes, it's an acute inflammatory marker, but it's also potentially a level of, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but when we're seeing a high saturation percentage and a high ferritin, that's more concerning than if we see a higher saturation and a lower ferritin. But is that actually not true?
No, very good question. I look for ideal iron.
Mm-hmm.
And if any one of the three, so real quick for the listeners, there's three containers for iron in the body. We talked about the bucket, but you know how big a bucket is. That's hemoglobin and myoglobin. That's 80% of the iron.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have a teacup. A teacup, much smaller, that's about 10% of the iron. And that's ferritin inside the cells. Not supposed to be in the blood, but about 10% of the iron is stored inside our tissue, and that's okay under ideal conditions. And then we have a third container, a thimble. We know how small a thimble is. That's 1% of the iron, and that's the serum iron that you're referring to.
Right.
And so I'm mindful of the three containers and the orders of magnitude that they represent in terms of size. But the 1%, even though it's smallest, is probably the most important because it tells me how well is the body recycling the iron that's needed 2.5 million times a second, right? That's a really critical indication. And anemia, formally, the formal definition of anemia, it's a very negative term, by the way. has a lot of negative connotation. But anemia is when there isn't adequate hemoglobin in the blood for that particular individual.
Yeah.
What's happened since 1972, Jacobs et al., 1972, famed British hematologist, published an article about serum ferritin, and they moved the spotlight from hemoglobin over to ferritin. And now practitioners are being trained, like circus bears, to believe that ferritin is an indication of iron status, when in fact it's really the bucket and the thimble, and ferritin is a misleading marker because of the nature of its function.
Interesting.
And so it's we're getting into some very delicate half-truths, because people swear by their ferritin numbers, or they swear by their this or that, and they don't know the interplay between copper and iron to regulate the physiology of the body.
Yeah. Well, and we're taught to, that the symptoms of low iron, that iron deficiency anemia, or as you referred to it, anemia of inflammation, but that iron deficiency anemia has symptoms that are so common, and then we can find that bias, that confirmation bias on blood labs, and then we can give them iron. And the problem is that those symptoms are very common. The fatigue, the poor sleep, a lot of that happens with a lot of things.
Right?
And so, so I think we might be mistreating,
The
not me personally.
symptoms that you're referring to are identical to the symptoms of copper deficiency, but you've never been trained in that.
Right. Well, so let's dig into that. All right. So let's talk about the general. Let's talk about copper, because in my training, let's face it, in my medical school training, I learned nothing about copper. In my orthopedic training, I learned nothing about copper. Right. In my second fellowship and board certification in the anti-aging space, I learned a little bit about copper. Right. But the only thing I really learned was don't supplement copper and zinc together, because they'll bind each other. And then I also learned that copper is dangerous. So reading your book and all of the jokes around copper, which are not few and far between in that book, I learned a lot about copper. So let's just give the audience, you kind of mentioned the general, how it's very intricately related to iron metabolism, but let's talk about why copper deficiency is likely a real thing in today's society. You kind of mentioned it a little bit. Let's talk about why we need to worry about copper, because I don't think people understand this big thing that I want you to get out, because I think people assume that we're getting plenty of copper, and I think you're going to tell me that we're not.
Absolutely not. Why do we need to worry about copper? Because copper creates energy. Copper clears exhaust. Copper carries electrons. Copper catalyzes critical enzymes. There's enzymes that people have never heard of. Even some of the most refined. I had occasion to have dinner with a very high profile, very, very high profile physician, and asked him what he knew about the PAM enzyme. He said, "The what?" I said, the PAM enzyme. And he said, "Well, what does that stand for?" And I told him it's 35 letters long. And he got initially very mad. Not at me. He realized his medical education wasn't complete. Then he got really sullen about it. Then he thought, what else don't I know, right? Because here's this guy next to me, he's talking to me about physiology I've never heard of. So the thing is, people need to be aware that copper is playing a critical role. You as a orthopedic surgeon, 45% of the body's tissue is connective tissue. You know that, right? Cartilage and ligaments and tendons and all, even arteries, blood vessels. Blood vessels are connective tissue. The fascia throughout our body, it's all connective tissue. Well, what makes that connective tissue so important is it's the blending of collagen strength with elastin flexibility. And you got to end those two together. Well, there's only one enzyme that does it. It's called lysyl oxidase, and it's copper dependent. Well, if lysyl oxidase doesn't do its magic, you get hypermobility syndrome, EDS. So the reason why So, I could go on. We don't have enough
On and on.
time.
Yeah, I got you.
So the thing is, why do I think we don't have enough? I was reading an article a few weeks ago about the epidemic of chronic kidney disease in Indian rice farmers. It's a huge crisis right now. This article was from 2017. And what they were pointing out and lamenting was the increasing dependence on glyphosate, Roundup, being used in rice farms in India. What people may not know is that glyphosate chelates minerals on a logarithmic scale, like an earthquake, logarithmic scale. And so it takes out magnesium at a 3. It takes out iron and zinc at a 9. And it takes out copper at a 12. So what does that mean? It means that it's taking out copper 1 billion times faster than it takes out magnesium. It means it's taking copper out 1,000 times faster than iron or zinc. So call me crazy, but I think there's a preferential focus, crosshairs are on copper. And so in this article, 2017, they reference the fact that in an earlier study done in France, and what you need to understand is that when glyphosate was being introduced to the world, French opposed it. It became against the law to use glyphosate in any form of farming. Absolutely verboten. I don't know what the word is in French for not allowed. But
Their neighboring country, that's fine.
That's right. But you're not allowed to use glyphosate in France, period. And in this article, 2017, Indian rice farmers, they allude to a study in France where 99% of the French citizens are peeing glyphosate in their urine now. And that's a crisis of biblical proportions, because what that means then is that glyphosate is in the air. It's everywhere on the planet now. Again, we got to think about copper as being chelated, not just a copper in the soil. It's the copper in the produce. It's the copper in the animals eating the produce, and it's the copper in the humans eating the animals and the produce. It's happening, folks. Then let's add insult to injury. Let's make a sweetener and put it in everything. It's called fructose, high fructose corn syrup. It's everywhere in the diet. And fructose turns into ethanol inside our body, and ethanol becomes sorbitol. Well, why is that a problem? Well, if you look up the research Briggs 1981, you find out that sorbitol chelates 98% of the copper in its vicinity. That's a serious problem. And then let's take it one step farther. A lot of people use antibiotics, right? I mean, you've used them throughout your career.
Sure.
Do you know how antibiotics work? It's really simple function. The chemicals take the copper out of the bacteria so they don't work. So what is an antibiotic? Antibiotic. It's anti-life. Do you think that taking the copper out of the bacteria stops at the bacteria? Or that it might actually go to the purple bacteria called our mitochondria? Ding, ding, ding. And now we've got 4th generation antibiotics like Cipro that is activated with fluoride, which binds up copper. So we are in a very precarious world now where I've just identified 3 agents, a farming agent, a food processing agent, and a pharmaceutical agent, that all 3 have a preferential focus on copper, and yet we're told we're copper toxic.
Right.
And the dynamic behind that is when copper is under stress, when there's oxidative stress in the body, it's going to affect its copper protein, ceruloplasmin.
Right.
And people have never heard that word. Most practitioners have never heard that word.
I had never heard it until I read your book, and I want to get into the labs on that. But let's talk then about, well, I guess that's probably where you were going, right? Ceruloplasmin and iron, but let's connect the two.
Yeah,
So we're copper deficient. We
right.
are storing iron inappropriately. How does that relate?
Well, the ATM function of ferritin requires that the ferrooxidase enzyme function is one of the many enzymes that's expressed in the ceruloplasmin protein. So you have to picture, wait. So people have heard of hepcidin, maybe. It's an
Maybe.
iron storage. It's an iron hormone, excuse me. It's 25 amino acids. That's not that big. Ceruloplasmin, 1,066. It's a beast. It has it's supposed to have 8 coppers inside it. There's no other protein on the planet that has that kind of size or composition of minerals. And so it's a very unique nutrient or naturally occurring peptide. And so it can express multiple enzyme functions. One of the most important, the one that's typically referenced in the literature, is called ferrooxidase. Ferro, iron, back to oxidase, let's oxidize it. And let's turn ferrous iron, +2 valence, into a +3 valence, so that we can load up the iron on either the ferritin protein or on the transferrin transport protein. 2 very important proteins that are regulating iron status. And so when copper is able to function naturally through its copper expression, copper enzyme expression, it's able to regulate iron and oxygen, and it prevents that catalytic reaction that they have. And if the iron can't get out of the ferritin, it festers. And you have to think about each atom of iron has 4 unpaired electrons. Nature abhors anything that's unpaired. Everything's supposed to be frickin' friend, yin and yang. And unpaired electrons are not our friend. And so we have 4,500 atoms times 4 inside ferritin. Then let's multiply that times 10 in hemosiderin. And it gets into really big numbers really fast. And that electromagnetic force that iron creates inside the tissue disrupts the natural signaling, the natural energy production, the natural regulation of the metabolism that we have. And it's completely hidden behind an iron curtain. We got to spell curtain right, C-U. And everyone focuses on the iron and they ignore the Achilles heel of the body is bioavailable copper. It's a very small amount. 100 milligrams of copper it fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin. 100 milligrams of copper, and the average adult has over 5,000 milligrams of iron. It's actually bigger than that. But the point is, the order of magnitude is 50 to 1. Again, you have fewer generals than foot soldiers. Right, and so all of the optics are on the iron. No one knows about the copper. And if you don't know about copper, if you don't know its functions in the body, then the iron-induced aging that's taking place in our metabolism appears like a disease. It looks like a disease because you're not aware of the metabolic dysfunction that's taking place because of the lack of energy and the lack of bioavailable copper.
So then this is what I've been starting to do in my practice, is to try to identify copper deficiency, because it's, we were talking before we started recording about some of the feedback that I'm getting from my team and the fear around copper. So I want to hit this in 2 ways, which is, one, the fear around copper is copper toxicity. We're told that we all have this like impending copper toxicity, and that the things that, we're going to see, liver is going to shut down, and we're going to see these things which are really more frequently associated with genetic conditions like Wilson's disease and inability to metabolize copper. But from a copper toxicity perspective, can you speak to that? Because you have you've educated a number of people who are replacing copper, and in the doses of 2, 4, 6 milligrams a day. Are you seeing? Are these practitioners reporting any incidences of copper toxicity that you're aware of?
If there are, I'm not hearing about it, and I think I would hear about it if there was a
I
problem.
would think so. Yeah.
I've got some clients, and again, I inspire people, I educate people, but at the end of the day, they're in charge of their recovery, right? And
Right.
so I have a laissez-faire attitude. I'm not a hands-on kind of guy, because I really believe that we're meant to be sovereign individuals and we should be able to heal ourselves. But that's my quirkiness showing through. But the point is, I've got some clients taking 6 or more of my Recuperate tablets. It's a 2 milligram capsule, and they're on top of the world. They're able to control their blood sugar. They're able to sleep. They're able to get through the day for the first time in most of their life. And so it's a very unique situation that, people worrying about liver function, the research that people aren't aware of is from 1928. March at the University of Wisconsin, May at the University of Kentucky. They withheld copper from rodents in both experiments. And in the Wisconsin study, iron filled up in the liver. As soon as you restrain copper in the diet, iron fills in the liver first and foremost. Eventually, it's going to go to the endocrine system. It's going to go to the heart. It's going to go to the brain. But it will always go to the liver first. And there's a reason for that, but we don't have time to get into the specific. But the thing is, in May, iron filled the red blood cells, and they became very dark and heavy and dense because of the iron buildup in these rodents' red blood cells. And so people don't know that copper and iron are on the seesaw, which we started talking about from the get-go. Low copper creates high iron, and it expresses in the physiology of the human being very clearly. It's just not measured in the blood test. And so the fear that people have really originates from the work of Carl Pfeiffer. He was a PhD that got his medical degree, became a psychiatrist. What should unnerve people is to find out he was a principal in the MK Ultra program with the CIA. But he wrote a very important article in the 1960s about, and a book after that called Mental and Elemental Nutrients. I think that was published in 1968. But in his article, he talked about copper becoming unbound from its protein, ceruloplasmin. And that phrase in that article became unbound copper. And then that phrase became copper toxicity. That was the transition over a period of years. And now what people need to know is that there are agents in our environment that cause that copper protein to blow up and to release the copper. And so it appears unbound, but it's immediately bound up by albumin or transcuprine or histidine. There is no unbound copper. That is complete urban myth. But it's hard to get the practitioners to accept that. But the point is, ascorbic acid blows up ceruloplasmin. When did we first know this? 1948. Excess sugars in the blood. Hyperglycemia, that I know you're very well trained in. Hyperglycemia blows up ceruloplasmin.
Right.
That's a serious problem. Hormone replacement therapy blows up ceruloplasmin. Antibiotics blows up ceruloplasmin. And so people don't know that this dynamic is taking place. And so the disconnect that we started with is low iron in the blood is masking high iron in the tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a corollary for copper. High copper in the blood is masking low copper in the tissue where it's needed. And so 1% of the copper in the body is found in the blood. 1%. 47% is found in the bone marrow. 27% is found in the muscle. 25% is found in the organs of the body. So 99% of the copper is in our tissue,
Right.
and we're trained like circus bears to focus on the 1% in the blood. It looks high. It must be toxic because Carl Pfeiffer told me so. And it is a complete misunderstanding in the same way that low iron and iron stuck in the tissue, that misrepresentation plays out in copper, but it's the inverse. And therein lies the confusion of copper-iron metabolism, because practitioners have not been taught the full truth of how these metals interact and are represented in the blood and the tissue. And you need to know both sides to give accuracy to the diagnosis.
Yeah. So I want to talk about labs next, but before we get there, you said something that is going to raise red flags for the majority of my audience. There's fireworks going off in the background and you just can't see them. And so what you said that's going to raise red flags for them is that hormone replacement therapy blows up ceruloplasmin. So let's just double click on that for a minute, because we have, in our bone health community and postmenopausal women, and even peri and premenopausal women, we have them on some potentially forms of hormone replacement. So can you just give me a little bit more of that? I hadn't heard that. So I'd love to learn more about that. What can be done potentially to prevent it, or is there no other way around it? If you're going to do one, you're going to get both.
Right. And I'm not trying to blow up your model. I really am not. I appreciate the importance of this conversation. They've known that estrogen replacement, it was first studied in birth control pills back in the 60s at University of Michigan. They knew in 64 there was a serious problem with what it was doing to ceruloplasmin. What we have to do is ask only one question. Why? Why are the hormones dysregulated? Right? And what I've pieced together, right? It's not one article that told me this, but after years and years and years of reading and reflection, all the hormones are responding to the state of oxygen in the body. And when does estrogen rise? Estrogen rises in the face of rising oxidative stress and low bioavailable copper. Estrogen is the backup plan to low bioavailable copper. The body always has a backup plan. Why is testosterone showing low? It's a great question. Why does everyone have low T, right? What it has to do with rising iron affects sex hormone binding globulin, which causes aromatase to turn testosterone into estrogen. There's a reason for this. Why is progesterone low? Well, to make progesterone, we've got to have magnesium and B6, right? It's critical. Absolutely essential. And so why are we losing magnesium? Oh, well, if copper's low, iron is high, and there's a magnesium burn rate attached to high iron because of its oxidative stress producing qualities. So magnesium is down, B6. Why is B6 being affected? Well, it turns out its active form is called P5P.
5P.
Pyridine 5-phosphate, right?
Right.
Well, there's an enzyme. You might want to sit down for this one. But there's an enzyme called P5P oxidase. And guess what activates it? It's copper.
Copper.
So we're back to progesterone is not at adequate levels because copper's low, iron is high, magnesium is down, the P5P oxidase can't fire, and so we can't make progesterone. And where did I really learn about the importance of copper? In the synthesis and the secretion of progesterone in females, especially? Studying mountain goats. It wasn't a human study, but it was a mountain goat study that was very revealing about what's really going on. So here's the deal. And again, I apologize if I threw out fireworks for everyone. Short-term hormone replacement therapy, it's amazing. Long-term, I think the play is to get the body back into mineral and metabolic balance and to be less dependent upon the alternative forms of stimulation. Again,
And Morley, are
deployment.
you specifically referring to hormone replacement as in oral birth control given to
No,
premenopausal women? You're referring to
no,
all forms.
right. Again, it's the phrase is it's bioidentical, right?
That's
I'm
the
not sure.
phrase. Yeah,
It's still synthetic.
sure.
And so you're talking to someone who goes out of their way to try to honor nature and our original factory settings. And we live in a very challenging environment. I'm not trying to be naive, but the thing is, wherever possible, I like to see people regulating themselves. When all this really came to light, Doug, it was over a decade ago when we started to promote the protocol. People started realizing that they didn't need their thyroid meds. I wasn't
Sure.
telling people, stop taking your thyroid. That was the farthest thing from my mind, because at that point, I just assumed there was such a thing as thyroid disease. And now
Yeah.
I've learned that's not true. And so that when people are able to when they have the right diet, and I'm sure you put a lot of emphasis on diet, when they get the right nutrients, the blueprint that runs our body gets activated. It knows exactly what to do. And then we're not as dependent on exogenous elements to run
Sure.
our body. And the goal is to really get it back to that factory
Yeah,
setting.
and I agree with that, especially with thyroid. That's a great example where we do see resolution of the need for thyroid hormone.
Right.
In fact, that's our goal. Generally, we're going to treat people temporarily, assuming they still have a thyroid.
Yeah.
But with hormone replacement, I can see what you're saying for premenopausal women. But as we start to lose hormones, then I think what I hear you saying is that optimize what you have, knowing though that you are not going to, as a postmenopausal woman, you are not going to optimize estrogen and progesterone. You're not going to make it.
Right.
So I think that's the issue where we run into, where we have women who are obviously, we have the bone health population with osteoporosis, estrogen and progesterone have powerful impact, testosterone as well. So that's a topic for another day. I just wanted to understand the details on that. So let's talk about, because we're hitting the hour mark.
Can we talk about osteoporosis real quick?
Yeah, sure.
It's not an estrogen issue.
It is a many thing issue, but estrogen does play a role with osteoclasts. But I'm interested in your thoughts.
What's accumulating in a postmenopausal woman? It's iron.
Iron. Sure.
Absolutely iron. And so iron activates a critical enzyme called acid phosphatase. Acid phosphatase breaks down the bone matrix and releases calcium. So you can take all the calcium you want. You can take all the vitamin D you want. You can take all of the drugs you want to, quote, replace that calcium. But until you deal with the iron problem, you're not going to correct it. And what is critical is another enzyme called alkaline phosphatase,
Yep.
which is activated by what? Magnesium. And in order to knit the bone matrix together, and there's a bunch of minerals involved, as we know, but there's two enzymes that are absolutely essential for proper bone matrix formation. You got to have lysyl oxidase. We're back to the same enzyme again. And there's another enzyme you may not have heard of called ascorbate oxidase. Anytime you see the word oxidase, think copper. And so we're using oxygen. And what does ascorbate oxidase do? It prevents the demineralization of the bone matrix. That's its function. And so the osteoporosis, it ends in OSIS, right? And that stands for oxidative stress is severe, caused by the iron buildup in the postmenopausal woman. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that there is obviously a higher inflammatory state, and I certainly would agree that that's definitely part of it. The challenge there, I think that anytime we try to look at one cause, especially when it comes to osteoporosis, because there are many, I think we're going to miss a lot of things. Because I think you could give a woman phlebotomy and replace copper all day long, but if she doesn't have estrogen, she's still going to lose bone. So estrogen plays a role. You're not going to convince me otherwise, because the women, they lose bone immediately when they lose estrogen. So there's no time for buildup of iron for that to be the major player in that perimenopause menopause window, right? Those first 5 years after menopause, when bone loss is like a free fall.
Right.
Now, I certainly could see that moving on, and that's, again, this is my interest in the whole space.
Yeah.
Is saying, okay, well, what other forms of oxidative stress can we deal with? How can we help optimize? So, I appreciate that. All right, we are running over, so let me just hit this. Labs for copper. We talked about the fact that serum copper is 1% of your body's copper. Yet when we look at
1%
labs,
of the blood. 1% of the blood.
1%, right, in the blood, right?
Right.
So when we look at labs, people will generally measure serum copper and call it a day.
Right.
That's not a great measure of copper. Other blood measurements that we measure are ceruloplasmin,
Yep.
which is a new one for us. So we're gathering data on that now, and it's pretty compelling. And there's some in one of our next topics, we're going to talk about why that's compelling. But how else can we measure copper other than those two? And how good of a marker is ceruloplasmin then as a biomarker for how much copper you have in the body, or how deficient you are, really, is what we want to know.
You love asking great questions.
Thank you.
The marker that it's those two markers, but we need to look at the ratio.
Okay.
So the ratio of serum copper divided by ceruloplasmin. Ideally, serum copper should be 100. Ceruloplasmin should be 30. Those are not my numbers. Those are Sternlieb and I never can remember the second author, but this is from a series of copper studies done by these two famed copper experts at Bell Laboratories, AT&T Bell Laboratories in upstate New York. Why were they studying human copper metabolism at a telephone factory? I have no idea. Don't go there. But the thing is, the ratio should be 3.33. Now, what you'll find is if it's below 3.33, the individual does not have enough copper in their diet. If it is above 3.33, we're back to a logarithmic differential. So if someone has a copper to ceruloplasmin ratio of 4.33, that means that the order of magnitude is 10 times greater than it should be. We look at 3.33, 4.33, I'm close, it's like a grade point average. No. It's a 10-fold differential. And so that indicates severe inflammatory activity inside the body. And so that ratio becomes another marker for inflammation for you as a practitioner.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because we're getting the labs already, but we're not calculating that ratio. So
it's a very simple ratio.
I'll add that to our dashboard.
The other thing you can do, the other one, if you want to get into another refined level of it, is uric acid. I talked about the exhaust. Ideally, uric acid should be a 4.
Wow, that's low.
That's considered, again, that's a standard that goes back to the 1950s. And so what you want is a ceruloplasmin of 30 and a uric acid of 4. So the ratio is 7.5. When that uric acid starts to come up, I have one of my graduates in my program, very gifted dentist in Manhattan. His ceruloplasmin was 17 and his uric acid was 7.2. And he said, well, I'm close, right? And I said, not even close. And so 30 divided by 4 is very different than 17 divided by 7.2. And so as that number gets smaller and smaller, you know you have a metabolic crisis in the mitochondria. And these are two surrogate measures of copper status, because the gold standard for copper would be what's called ferroxidase enzyme expression. Again, we're back to the primary enzyme expression of ceruloplasmin. That enzyme expression, so a ceruloplasmin of 30, that's considered its height, its level. It's the level of ceruloplasmin is 30. That's like its height. I'm 6 feet tall. And so the real measure of copper status is how functional is the ferroxidase enzyme function, measured in a completely different way, and it's measuring IQ. Well, can you tell my IQ because I'm 6 feet? No. My height has nothing to do with my IQ. And the enzyme expression of ceruloplasmin, the ferroxidase enzyme, is not allowed by the FDA. It's expressly barred by the FDA. And you can go to Iceland, you can go to India, you can go to Germany, and you can get this study done. But it's not allowed in the U.S. And a curious mind would say, gee, I wonder why. Because they don't want us knowing our copper IQ. They just want to know our copper height. Because it's not as revealing.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Morley. I think it's a really interesting look at iron and copper metabolism and how we potentially may be copper deficient. We may have iron overload, and it's difficult to interpret the biomarkers for most physicians to understand how to look at those things so that we could potentially treat accordingly. If you want to learn more about how we manage patients, particularly in the osteoporosis side, consider coming to our masterclass. You can look for the link in the description on YouTube or go to drdouglucas.com if you're listening to this on a podcast. And you can check out our masterclass where we talk about how we manage osteoporosis. We can also then, on that same webpage, look at our HealthSpan Nation, our Bone Foundations course, and all of our other resources there. So thanks so much for making it to the end of this video. I'll see you next time.